So welcome everyone. I'm Patty Compton, and this is the Music Preserve stage. And people were asking me who I was the most excited to interview today, and I said Julia Simon, because she is a wealth of knowledge on the blues, and I'm most through her book. I'm about 3/4 of the way through her book called Time in the Blues, and she's also a professor up at UC Davis. So I'm really excited to talk to her, and we're definitely going to learn something here today. So hi, Julia.
Hi, thanks for having me, Patty. I really appreciate this.
Of course.
Very excited to be here.
Of course. So one of the things that her book is about, your book is about time in the blues, and you keep using the word temporality.
Yeah.
And so I thought maybe we would start with maybe defining temporality.
Sure. So the book is not just about lyrics that talk about the blues. It's really about the way we feel time, we experience time. And so that's really what temporality is. And so what I explore in the book is the kinds of structures that shape the way people who in the beginning created the blues, how they experience time and how that gets reflected in the blues. So that might be in the lyrics of the blues, but that might be in the feelings that are generated by the musical background. It might be in the rhythms of the blues. So it's all those different things. So it's not just the theme of time. It's not just minutes seem like hours, hours seem like days, something like that. But it's really about the way the blues makes you experience time and how that relates back to some of the experiences of time that might have shaped the blues.
Right. So, she talks about the sharecropping experience and how, as they were living their daily life, that they were always, for one thing, they were always in the present.
Absolutely.
So, the blues is really always set in the present because the people who created the blues were very intensely focused on present, because part of the reason is they couldn't really think future because they were stuck in this. They couldn't plan for a future. They were stuck in this system of sharecropping. So everything was focused on the present day.
Absolutely. So a lot of people have heard the word sharecropping, but not very many people know what the reality of sharecropping was. So you got to figure at the end of the Civil War in 1865, the biggest modern slave economy got broken up, and they needed a new system of labor management in the South. And sharecropping eventually came about because the planters had no money. They were living on credit all the time. So these guys would come along in January and they'd agree to a contract. And I'm hesitant to say they signed a contract because many of them were illiterate. They just put an X at the bottom. And they agreed to farm on shares. That's what we think of it as, right? We figure that they're going to get half at the end of the year. But the reality is it's a system set up to get people into debt. So at the beginning of the year, they give them what they called the furnish, and that was seeds and the use of a mule and a pair of overalls and maybe some shoes. And so that's the furnish, but that's on credit, right? They got to pay that money back. And then as the time goes along and the contract get around March, April, they're kind of starving. Their families are starving. So they're not getting paid. They're never getting paid. So they got to go to the commissary store and they buy on credit. Most of them never know how much they're spending for a sack of meal or some molasses or maybe some fat back, right? They're not living high on the hog, that's for sure. So all along, they're sort of building up this debt, right? They're buying on credit. They wear out the shoes. They got to get a new pair of shoes. So they harvest in September, October, and the planter takes the cotton and sells it, never tells them how much he gets for the cotton. But at the end of the year, in December, it's settling time, right? They decide how much these guys have made for a year of labor. And pretty much either they break even or they're in debt, right? So these poor guys, they worked all year, working hard day in and day out. Some of them were educated. Some of them could read and write. Some of them could keep books on their own. Some of them tried to keep an account of what they bought in the commissary store and save up. one great story, a guy hid a bale of cotton, right? And then the guy comes up and he does his total. The planner says, "Hey, you broke even. It's great. You don't owe me anything." And he goes, "Well, you know what? Shoot, I got this bale of cotton I forgot about." So what does the planner do? He says, "Hey, I think I got to recalculate that. Give me back." So he figures out a way to get that money from that last bale of cotton that he hid. So no amount of planting, no amount of saving, no amount of anything is going to get you out of this debt. And you may even owe at the end of the year. Now, they can't keep you there against your will. That's debt peonage. But a lot of them were kept there against their will anyway. So that's why they can't think about the future, right?
Right. So it's just, thinking about the creators of the blues and what their daily life was like. Another thing that, and how that translated into the music. Another thing that I that was interesting was the pace of their life, how it was very monotonous, over and over the same daily thing. And the only time, they had something different when maybe they would get a letter and that would break it up for a second, but then they would go back to that pace of life, and how that translated into the blues and that pace, the relentless sort of over and over pace of the blues. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So you think about it. I mean, you got a yearly cycle of planting the crop, chopping the crop back, right? Chopping back the weeds, letting it grow, harvesting, picking, doing all those things. But you got the monotony of daily life of literally eating 3 kinds of food, having 1 pair of clothes that you wear, right? Day in and day out, it's just the same life with very, very little changes. And so when you think about the blues, most blues goes in a cycle, right? You hear the progression of the 12 bars, right? And, there are 8-bar blues, there's 13.5-bar blues, but still it's that very repetitive cycle. It's very predictable. You know what's going to happen. And so in some ways, the temporality of being stuck in sharecropping and being stuck doing the same things over and over. And I like to think about the blues in this way. We got a progression that kind of hits a high point when it hits that 5 chord, and it goes down to the 4, and then there's the turnaround, and the turnaround just sets up to do it all over again. And I think these guys must have felt that way. Come settling time, they're thinking, maybe, just maybe, I'll make a little money this year. Oh, I guess not. Let's set it up for another time around. So the blues has its moments when you feel like there's a little forward progress. Sometimes in a solo, you feel a vector towards some kind of a future. And yet it always comes back to that cycle. It always cycles around. So I hear that experience of sharecropping in that formal cycle of the blues.
So I think this is fascinating about, thinking about, how the blues was created, and that, the people that created it was from their experience of time and how they translated that into the experience of the time in the music. Another thing that I think is interesting is how you talk about Parchment Farm type, can you go into that for a little bit?
Sure. This will take a minute here. For those of you who've maybe heard the words Parchment Farm, that's sometimes in some lyrics of the blues. You might have heard a reference to Parchment Farm. Book of White has down on Parchment Farm. Now, Parchment Farm is actually the Mississippi State Penitentiary. That's what it is. It is a farm, but it's not a farm. So during slavery, there are no jails per se in the South. I mean, there's some prisons for whites, but slaves are just punished by their masters. I shouldn't say just, because it wasn't just. They were severely punished by their masters. After the Civil War, they got to start to build prisons, and obviously under Jim Crow, those are segregated prisons. And the state of Mississippi is kind of perpetually in debt. It's an economy that's not going anywhere. They don't even really have the money for a prison. So a guy named Parchman runs the prison system, and he says to the state, "Tell you what, I'll sell you my land and we'll make it into a prison." And believe it or not, Parchman Farm is a large sharecropping enterprise because the state of Mississippi can't afford to pay for Parchman Farm. So whatever they farm, they're going to pay back to this guy on halves, which is just crazy. So where are they going to get the labor to make the cotton, to get the state out of debt? Yeah, no. They're going to trump up charges against African Americans all the time. So they pass vagrancy laws, which pretty much you just blink your eyes and you're arrested on vagrancy. They stop a freight train, see if anybody's on there without a ticket, they pull them off, and then they put them in a trumped up court, get some plantation boss to say, yeah, you're going. And it's interesting that the sentences at Parchment Farm are kind of like a year or life. There's very little in between. So there's a young male African-American population held captive down on Parchment Farm. That's what that means. Living in a cell, wearing the prison garb, and chopping cotton, farming cotton from, they used to say from can to can't, from can see in the morning till can't see at night. And they would choose certain prisoners, they'd call them trustees, and they'd give them a rifle. So these guys would have a rifle trained on the other prisoners who are out there in the field. And so you literally have a death threat on you while you're out there living, right? I mean, it's really kind of hard to imagine. You might be chained to the next prisoner in a kind of a chain gang situation. And let's just think for a second, if any of you have ever been to Mississippi in the summertime. Oh my, right? 100% humidity, 100-degree temperature. Think about what it must feel like to be out in the fields as a prisoner on mean rations, living in a prison. So I think that, that bleak lack of future, focus on the present moment that you get in the blues might just be part of a coping mechanism. Yeah, for when you're on Parchment Farm.
Yeah, I agree. And another thing that I thought was interesting is how the prisoners were all young.
Yeah.
And how, when you're young, you experience time, like you're waiting for school to get out or you're waiting for Christmas and it just seems like it takes forever. And then when you're older, it like flies by like, oh no, it's Christmas already. So I kind of felt like that what she was describing in the book was that the fact that they were all young and part of what you talked about too was that a lot of them, a lot of them died. You know what I mean? A lot of them didn't make it. I mean, it was like you either like to stay there 10 years was like unheard of. Like they would not make it.
Yeah.
But the fact that that their age made them experience time and that like the intensity of the waiting, the intensity of the time. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So you got to imagine yourself. You're this young kid, 18 years old, grown up in the South, never had much of anything, arrested on trumped-up charges, sent off to Parchment Farm, and you're doing this labor day in and day out, and now you don't even have family. I mean, if sharecropping was bad, this is even worse. And you're a young person. You have your future ahead of you. And so I just try to imagine what every second feels like, right? Every minute, every second, just dragging out on and on and on. And if you think of some of the blues music, one of the songs I talk about that Patty's referencing here, I think, is Muddy Waters' Long Distance Call. You guys maybe know that song. At the end of it, he says, hear my phone ringing, right? But a lot of that song is just a big tease because you're waiting for that phone to ring. You just feel that feeling of waiting, right? Even the instruments are just a little behind the beat. The fills to the vocal are just a little behind, and they're making us feel that feeling of waiting. And so I feel like there's this intense pressure, this intense waiting, and the way to cope with it is kind of live in the moment. Try to figure out a way to enjoy what's going on in the moment. And that might be why blues music really has so much of that feel. Even though we're waiting, we're kind of on the edge of our seat waiting, like maybe those guys were, for their chance to break out of Parchment Farm, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because before I read this book, it's the stuff that you kind of know, but you don't really like think about it so much that the actual experience of time and the temporality, of these young people in this situation, it created the pacing of the blues and the feeling and the timing and the lyrics and everything about the blues is their experience, put down.
Absolutely. And so Parchment Farm is just one of the horrible things that can happen to you. Now, Mississippi didn't really have any other things going on for it in terms of the economy. So they had Parchment Farm, they had the cotton farm. But other states where plenty of blues artists grew up, they might have had mines, they might have had turpentine camps. Sometimes in Mississippi they had like a cane break that they needed to clear and railroad to put through. So you know what the state did? It leased its prisoners out to these companies and for pennies a day, right? And so, they used to say for mules, they'd say one dies, buy another. And for prisoners, they'd just say one dies, get another, right? Because they just really don't care. And so if you think the labor was bad, and I think the labor was bad, chained to somebody else, digging through a swamp, trying to clear out a cane brake during the day, at night, they would put them in these double-decker train cars chained to one another. So even at night and on weekends, they're just chained together in these train cars. The conditions are so appalling that it's almost hard to think about what that might be. And I think, the more I read about it, the more I thought, wow, there's just such an intensity to the present experience for these people, just coping from second to second, from minute to minute, just trying to get through this experience. And I think some of the intensity of the present moment that's in the blues might just come from that, right? A way that not other music doesn't necessarily have that feeling of sitting on the edge of your seat, right? Waiting for the vocalist to do something, waiting for the person soloing, the harmonica player, the guitar player, to sort of do something. But I think when you look at these conditions, you think, yeah, maybe that feeling might just have come from those horrendous experience. Convict lease went on and on and on. I mean, the federal government outlawed it, but man, those states in the South are pretty good at getting around the rules.
Keeping things going for decades longer. Yeah. And at Music Preserves Foundation, we believe that the history of American music is really the cultural history of the United States. So. And it's not really taught in schools. We teach about the presidents and the wars, and then we might teach music on the side, but we don't teach about the history of music and the cultural history of the United States. So that's one of the aims that we have with Music Preserves Foundation. And with our very first guest, Julia Simon, I think that we're hitting it with that. And thank you.
Thank you.
And what I'd like to just ask about, how... thank you. The idea of your research and your insights, as creating part of that as part of our education program, I think is very important. Like, how do you feel, as a professor too, about, taking this knowledge and these insights and translating it into educational programs?
It's such an important thing because I think, I do teach a big class on the blues at UC Davis, and my students have never really thought about this music. Many of them have never heard it before. But they certainly don't think about where it comes from. And what happens when you start to think about the conditions that gave rise to a new kind of music and what might be expressed, you start to listen to all music differently. So they listen to rap differently. And actually I have to do a day where I talk about rap and the blues and how the South Bronx in the late 70s ain't that different from Jim Crow, Mississippi, right? And so, I think educationally it's an important thing. It's an important thing to keep the blues alive and get new fans and get people to understand, but also to understand the history of this country, because we don't teach the history from this direction. This is not the way we do it.
It's the people's history, really.
Yeah, exactly.
There were a lot of different cultures that built this country, of course. But thank you so much. I feel like it's this is amazing to talk to you and to get this perspective and to translate it into education, because I feel like that's what we need to teach the younger generation. Just a little bit about the cultural history and how the blues became, why it sounds like it does, why the beat is like it is, why the lyrics are what they are. It didn't just come out of nowhere. It came out of their experience. And it's the basis for rock and roll and everything. I mean, it's the basis for all the music that came after it, really.
Absolutely.
So it's the foundation of American music.
It really is the foundation of American music. Can I give a little plug for the podcast?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so we talked about the book a little bit, and I have some flyers up here for the book. But I also have a podcast that I created. It's called Blues on My Mind. And I have a site called bluesonmymind.com. and it's on the podcast apps. And in every episode, I just take one song and I talk about that song. I've got like 39 episodes at this point, and some of it, talks about some of the stuff we've talked about today. I just did about 9 episodes on animals and the blues. And when I do, I tell you a little bit about the song and I play a little bit of the song, and then I just start talking about it. And I'll replay a segment of it and I'll kind of help you listen. And each segment is only about 20 minutes. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about some of these songs, check it out, bluesonmymind.com. I've got cards for that too if you're interested.
That sounds great. Yeah. Does anyone in the audience want to ask Julia a question? Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nikki. Thanks so much for this. It's a very interesting theme for your book, The Experience of Time. And I was wondering if you were talking about this with musicians and what their thought of this was.
Yeah.
As you wrote this book, if you interviewed people.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, part of the answer is that I'm a musician too. For 9 years, I was a drummer in a blues band, and for the last 9, I've been a bass player in a blues band. And since I'm in the rhythm section, dealing with time all the time, that's a big part of it. So part of it is lived experience of performing this music too. But yeah, I did, and actually, one of the people who wrote a blurb for the book is Nick Moss. He's going to be on the stage tomorrow, and I'll tell you what he wrote because I'm really proud of it. He said, "Finally, someone has explained to people that don't play the music what we see and feel from our side of the stage." So I talked to Corey Harris, Alvin Youngblood Hart, Guy Davis. I've talked to a bunch of musicians along the way, plus all the folks I play with up in the Sacramento area. So yeah, and it is part of that experience of what happens to when you structure time when you're playing the song, right? So as the bass player or as the drummer in particular, you're setting the tempo, you're setting the rhythm. And I'll give you one example. In the blues, a lot of songs, the 1 and the 3 beats, measure 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 3 are right on the beat. 2 and 4 is where you create the pocket. So they're slightly behind, right? The snare drum beat is slightly behind, and the bass player with the bass line is doing that too. So you feel that rhythm, and there's that slight hesitation and that structuring of time. Even if it's just a split section, people in the audience feel that too is just a little bit behind. So that's part of that sense of temporality in the blues that you just know is different from other music, right? When you start hearing those rhythms. But yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
All right, great question. Is there anyone else that would like to ask a question? Wonderful.
Hi, my name is Mark. Thank you very much for this.
Hi,
my
Mark.
question is, many times I hear sounds in the blues like the sound of a locomotive.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, how if you're using words, onomatopoeia describes the sounds you're hearing, and you're using your words to express it.
Right.
I wonder, have you approached that as far as the blues and some of the sounds?
Absolutely, yeah. You're absolutely right. There's onomatopoeia in the blues. And when I talk to my students about this, I always tell them you're going to find the onomatopoeia in the instruments more than you're going to find it in the lyrics, right? So we just mentioned Muddy Waters' Long Distance Call. You either get the piano player to make the phone ring, right? And you get the harmonica player to make the phone ring. Or let's see, what else I think about. You think about sort of slide guitar sounds and what you can do in terms of howling and moaning and wailing and those kinds of sounds. So, yeah, no doubt about it. Actually, I'm thinking about Bring It On Home, the Sonny Boy Williamson song that starts out with that train rhythm. And not just a train rhythm in the song, but an acceleration of the tempo, like a train is speeding it up, right? He says, "Take my seat, ride way back," right? And then it starts to sort of pick up the tempo of the song. And normally in other genres, you don't pick up the tempo of the song. You set the tempo of the song. But you're right. There's a kind of imitation of that train sound and that acceleration of the train. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Yeah, these Doheny blues fans are very well versed.
They are.
Yeah,
I love it.
Do we have any other questions while we have the opportunity to speak with Julia Simon? Or any other questions about music preserves? All right, I'll give the microphone back to my boss.
I'm not actually his boss, but we're. Well, thank you so much, Julia.
Thank
and
you,
I was
Patty.
just wondering if I don't know if we have a minute, but maybe just if there's like one song that you have that you have in mind that you want to just talk a little bit about. I mean, you just did, but if you want to if there's another one that you just think that's very commonly known that you could just say something
right,
about.
Yeah, right when we get up on the stage here, Son House's Death Letter was playing, and that was the first song I ever wrote an article about. And Time and Death Letter is super interesting. You mentioned the letter. He says, got a letter this morning. How do you reckon it read? It said, hurry, hurry, the gal you love is dead, right? So that's a good example of his boring life being interrupted. And as bad as his life was, it just got worse because this woman's dead, right? And this has a kind of unusual verse structure. Most blues have A and they repeat the A line and they have B, but Death Letter goes A, B, A, B. And when he repeats most of the time, he says, I said, I got a letter this morning. How do you reckon it read? So the temporality of the song is quite interesting because he's telling us a story. I got a letter this morning. How do you reckon it read? So it's something that happened in the recent past. But then when he says, I said I got a letter this morning, he's reminding us that we're now here with him listening to this story. So there's sort of two times in the song. We're there with him listening to this story, and we're back in the past while he's doing it. And if you take a listen again, it's kind of a fascinating thing. Of course, Son House was really a kind of what they call a folk blues player, so he's making it up on the spot. But later on in the song, he starts saying again, woke up this morning, and it's now a different morning. So time is a kind of flexible, strange thing, and it jumps all over the place. And it's now, and it's in the past, and it makes reference to a whole tradition out there, right? And so, I mean, I like to think of it as this great resonating, echoing chamber of the present where you can kind of feel the past and you can kind of anticipate the present, and yet you feel hemmed in that present. So if you have a chance to listen to Son House's Death Letter, check it out.
Thank you. And now we'll hear it differently when we listen to Son House. That letter. Well, thank you so much, Julia. We really appreciate you coming here and spending time with us on the Music Preserve stage.
Thank you so much, Patty. I've had a great time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.